Hey there, sports psych enthusiasts. I'm Dr. Colin Fehr, and I want to share my passion with you. I love talking about ways to unleash the power of the mind. This recording is part of a larger lecture series I've created in an effort to make sports psychology concepts more accessible to a larger audience. The information contained in this series is especially well suited for students of sports psychology and is presented in a way that makes for easy listening for all. Welcome to Sports Psych Concepts.
Hey there, everyone. Here we are in another Sport Psych Concepts lecture recording, and I've been thinking about some people in the sporting world that could benefit from some of these ideas from sports psychology and implementing that. And that is, of course, sport coaches, those individuals who really have more touch points, more impact on athletes than a sports psych practitioner really probably ever could, just because of the amount of time that there's interfacing going on there. And so sports psychology for coaches is like this little sub theme I have here in my lecture series. And so I'm going to do a few of these, and this is you could call this one part one. So for the sport coaches out there, this will provide some foundational ideas on sports psych, what you need to know about that, how you could get started with things like intakes, or just what you might need to look for if you're trying to assess mental skills and you want to be more intentional or systematic about that. So the needs assessment, because coaches tend to be really good at the X's and O's, those sorts of things, technical, tactical, even physical training. So it's just this mental side of things that I want to focus on here to hopefully really have an amplified signal, because sports psych, it can be hard to get that info out there, get the tools out there in the right hands of people to use them. A lot of it happens kind of organically on its own, but if we can become more systematic about it like we do all the other things, particularly if we can get coaches on board and using more of these tools, I think that can be really helpful. So that's the overarching idea for the presentation today, and some others that will follow with this. So with that intro, let's get started on the topics I have prepared. So what I want to start with in this presentation is really elementary, and again, it's geared towards sport coaches, or if we're working with sport coaches out there, how might we capture this in a way that's easily digestible and easy to understand. So just looking at sports psychology definitionally and operationally on a high level view, at the core of this, it's certainly a scientific study, but we're just looking at how people behave, like what their actions are, what they think, how they feel within the context of sports settings, so both training and competition. And when we're thinking about what we're trying to accomplish with sports psychology work, we've got two primary objectives. The first is just to ensure the psychological well-being of our athletes, right? And then in addition to that, we certainly want to maximize their performance. So there's both ends of the spectrum there, making sure that we're addressing their needs in terms of well-being, but then also figuring out ways we can enhance their performance. So as coaches, when coaches provide psychological support, it's important to recognize that you may be entering a sort of a dual role relationship here that can blur the lines. And so that's important to understand, because there are boundaries of competence, there's responsibilities, and so coaches need to make sure that they're staying in their lane with what it is they know how to do. Now, I say that because, like, well, you can't really dive into the deep stuff, but you absolutely can do mental skills training. You can adhere to and implement a lot of the different things that even a mental performance consultant would do, as long as you've got the training and you stay within your scope of practice. And so that's really important to understand as we get going here. So with all of that in mind, I do want to expound a little bit more on some ethical considerations, because the dual role thing, right? That's a big thing. Got to make sure as coaches you understand those ethical boundaries. And so you're a coach first, right? You're not a licensed psychologist. You're not I mean, maybe in some instances you might be a certified mental performance consultant. So definitely you've got a broader scope of practice. But if your main role is you're the sports coach and you don't have those other credentials or maybe even specific training, then that's what you want to focus on. Okay. But to give you an even more specific example of a boundary of competence, right, is you're not a mental health practitioner. Most mental performance consultants aren't either. They dabble on the spectrum, somewhere on the spectrum, depending on what their training is, from mental performance to mental health. But as a sports coach, like, that's not what you're doing. So you shouldn't be attempting to diagnose some sort of mental health disorder or provide advice on issues that are just beyond your area of expertise. So an example might be you got an athlete with an eating disorder. You obviously got to work with that athlete. You can provide some foundational advice and coaching on basic things within your control. But if it's clinically significant, that's a psychological disorder, which in most cases that's going to be on the scope of practice for most sport coaches. Okay, and so when whatever the athlete needs is outside of your capabilities, it's your responsibility as a coach to refer them to the proper professional. That might be a licensed sports psychologist. It might be a certified mental performance consultant. In some instances, it might be, it could just be a counselor that's at the institution that you're at. A lot of different things. Whoever's in the referral network, that community of practice, that's what's important. Now, it's also important to handle that conversation with the athlete with some care, because athletes, like, you're the coach, they don't they many times, if you're at the college level, they came there and you were a big reason why they came there, and so it can feel like you're dumping them off when really you're just trying to make sure they get the best care that they need. And so we want to handle that conversation as best we can when they're dealing with psychological issues, because we want them, ultimately we're looking after their well-being, and so we want to make sure we go about that in the best possible way. Now I want to talk a little bit more, because I mentioned it, the understanding mental health and what it is I'm talking about with that. So just definitely definitionally, again, mental health disorders, the way to think about these are clinically significant disturbances in the individual's thinking, their cognition, emotions, what they're feeling, or their behavior and what they're doing. And so as a coach, you're not qualified to treat those issues, but even still, it's important to have a basic understanding of them. That's probably vital for you as a coach. And your primary responsibility as a coach is to create an environment that is promoting their mental well-being and reduces stressors where necessary and helps them deal with the stressors that you can't really reduce, because that's part of sports and competing in performance. So very important to understand that. It's also important to make sure that you're aware of how you talk about mental illness. That can create a sort of negative and unsupportive culture. It can contribute to some of the stigma that's out there on how we talk about it. And mental illness, again, it's like those unseen injuries, and many athletes deal with these things because just the stress and the strain of competition and training and everything that they're doing is really high, and that can contribute to it. And so we can also contribute to that. We can make it create an environment that isn't really that's maybe a little hostile to those things and not conducive to encouraging people to actually get the help that they need. So very important to understand these things on a foundational level. So how do we then, on the flip side of that, foster well-being in our athletes? So there's several things that you can do to create that environment that's more supportive, that's more protective of your athletes, while still being able to push them, because they need to be pushed. That's absolutely an essential part of it. So it's not like you're shielding them from the discomforts of what's required for them to perform at a high level. It's certainly not what I'm suggesting, but it's just recognizing that there's boundaries to that, or limits to that we have to be aware of. So one of the first things to consider on this is just to make sure we're using the appropriate training loads to prevent things like burnout or overtrainings or paying attention to their symptoms of fatigue. And so we're looking at both elements there, because the burnout's more like psychological, overtraining is more of the physiological manifestations of what's going on inside their body. So we want to make sure that we know what we're doing in terms of prescribing their training loads, just in a simple way there. We also want to make sure that we acknowledge and reward more than just the wins, but the effort and the improvement, the things that lead to the wins, because we can't control the competition, and so we, the outcome is not the only measurement of success. And so that's a really important thing as well for coaches that they can do. It can significantly reduce anxiety to where they're not then they're not afraid of losing, right? They want to win because that's represents the striving and the improvement that they're going for, but they're not afraid to try, um, and take risks and make mistakes that sometimes can contribute to losing, because they know that they've got to learn from those things in order to win eventually. So we also can give athletes some control over what they're doing in practice, certain activities, and also when they perform them. That can be a protective factor against some mental health issues. So just supporting their autonomy, and it doesn't mean that they have to decide everything, but just giving them some sense of autonomy and supporting them is a really, really healthy thing for supporting their mental health. And then definitely want to encourage friendships and positive relationships within the team, as those are also strongly linked to psychological well-being. So just a few tips there on this topic. Now let's shift, because I mentioned at the beginning there's some tools of assessment that are available, and these are more specific. Like, coaches are familiar with assessment. We have performance metrics, we have statistics and things that we look at. And so this is just shifting and saying, all right, well, what do we have to assess some of their mental skills? And there's formal questionnaires out there. There's surveys, right? Written surveys, lots of things that have fixed choices, things that are yes or no. They're on Likert scales, 1 to 5, 1 to 7, different things like that. And there can be a lot of advantages to these, because they're usually really quick for athletes to complete. They're not super long in terms of the respect to their time. And then you get some objective scores. Now, obviously, if they're self-report things, there's some subjectivity to that, and the risk of social desirability bias. So it's important to iterate to the athletes that you want them to take it serious and be honest in how they're responding to those things. That's important. But the data can be useful, and it can allow you to do like pre and post season comparisons, or mid season, whatever. You can compare an athlete's score on some sort of specific quality that you're looking at, like anxiety. Now, generally, you don't really want to compare teammates to each other, right? And then just like, oh, well, this person's high on this, and so that's probably, you want to compare them to themselves. So it's important to recognize that there's limitations here, and there's not. It's just a number, right? Many times you get a composite score, and so you don't have this sort of rich qualitative information, and the athletes can't explain their experiences if we're only relying on the survey that's there. So it can be helpful to follow up and have conversations and discussions around what is there. And sometimes athletes just don't see the point in that. So it's very important that coaches explain why we're using a particular tool. If it's this type of survey, this sort of instrument, to reiterate, like, this is, we're doing this because we want to find as many ways possible to improve, and 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 so this is just another element. If we get 1 to 2% better out of this because it gives us something else to target that we can work on, then that's what we want. So the pitch that coaches need to have when they're presenting this to their athletes needs to keep those things in mind. Now, a very specific thing I want to mention here as a foundational element for coaches in the realm of sports psychology. Now, I could talk about this with some other components, but I think it fits really well right here as a sort of a foundational upfront thing is goal setting. And I've talked to many college coaches, and they know that goal setting is important, but they don't really know how to do it. And so maybe even if some of them don't do it, but even if they do set goals, it's not really the systematic process. It's informal. They set goals, they write them down at the beginning of the year, then they never talk about them again till the end of the year. So I want to emphasize how important it is to get this right, because there's plenty of goal setting sessions that have gone really well and then ended up being meaningless over the course of the season. And I've even experienced this myself as a mental performance consultant. Thought I had a good session, but then the coach, because ultimately after that it's on the coach if they want me to come in and it's just a one and done sort of thing, which isn't ideal. But then if the coach isn't going to carry that banner through, then it's not important. So very, very important is what I'm suggesting to coaches here is the power of goal setting, right? We're setting specific objectives. We have a target, what our athletes want to achieve on an individual level, but also as a team. Goal setting works. It's backed up by research. Lots of really good things. If we set those very specific, well-defined goals, it consistently enhances performance. So it's a very useful tool. It's a foundational thing. We have some assessment, then we set some goals based on that to direct the athlete's attention and effort toward the most relevant activities. Okay, so much better than simply telling an athlete, well, do your best, right? There's oftentimes you hear those things, or do your best goals is what we call them. It's like, okay, well, I mean, that's it's not a bad idea in principle, but it's just not specific enough for them to understand how each of the actions that they take are getting them closer to something that they desire. So setting goals can be a powerful tool, but it has to be done properly. And so I've just given you some basic ideas here to set the stage for that. So now let's talk about some different types of goals with that foundation. And I'm gonna there's different ways that you can present this, but I'll just kind of use the classic way. There's different types of goals, and we need to understand how they relate to each other and how we use them. So the most typical goal that coaches are familiar with is an outcome goal. So we're just looking at the result. We want to win a championship. And it's good to set these goals. However, they're most of the time they're outside of the athlete's complete control. You can't control whether you become a starter on the team, because if the coach is deciding that, you can't really control it. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't set that goal and work toward it, but it shouldn't be the only thing that we fixate our mind on. So then we have performance goals, and performance goals just focus on personal improvement. So we've got a specific goal. If I'm a basketball player, I want to improve my shooting percentage. So there's a quantitative metric attached to these oftentimes. Maybe not always, but you definitely want to be able to measure it somehow. That's a characteristic of a good goal, is something that you can measure. So performance goals usually are tied to some sort of metric there. And if you think about it, performance goals lead to outcome goals. You meet certain performance standards that are much more within your control. I mean, not totally, right? Your shooting percentage, maybe if you're shooting free throws on the basketball court, you can control that more. But everything else, you can't totally control what the defense is going to do, whether you're going to get the types of shot opportunities, all of that. Okay, but you do have some control over it, much more than the outcome itself. And so those are really good because they'll lead to those outcome goals. And then we have process goals at the most foundational level. So these are just specific actions that are required to perform a skill. And so these things will lead to your performance goals, which then will lead to the outcome goals. So these are completely within the athlete's control. So for example, many times athletes we want to try and get more sleep, they want to eat healthier or whatever, those sorts of things. Like, okay, well, how do we define that, make it more specific? Well, every night at 9 p.m. I'm gonna the alarm on my phone or my device is gonna go off as a reminder that it's time for me to start my wind down routine. And so I'm going to initiate my wind down routine, and I'm going to be in bed by 9:15 p.m. or 9:30 p.m., whatever the specific is for the athlete, every single night. and then I'm going to sleep until 6 a.m., 7 a.m., however much sleep it is that they're needing, depending on what they have going on. Okay, so that's a process goal that can be tied to performance and outcomes. If they're getting enough sleep, they're recovering, all of that. Very important. So I imagine that anybody listening has heard of the SMARTS principle, setting SMART goals, right? Specific, measurable, action oriented, realistic, timely or time bound, and self-determined. So that's those really are the criteria for what makes a good goal. It needs to meet all of those things, be really specific, measurable, have some time bound thing, have all those other elements. That's very, very important. And so however we frame each of these types of goals, whether outcome goals, performance goals, or process goals, we want them to adhere to those SMARTS criteria. Okay, so now let's shift away from goal setting as a primary tool, and we'll talk about another really foundational tool that coaches can use. That again, and you'll notice, because I'm talking about assessment and some foundational things, these are not like what many coaches would think. Oh, sports, it's psychology, so there's going to be these diagnostic assessments that the athletes are going to take, and if they meet these certain criteria, then it'll mean this thing. Like, those tools exist, but those are most likely going to be outside the scope of a practitioner. But some basic assessments, intake things, setting goals, performance profiling, all of these things are within the scope of what a coach can do, which is why I'm mentioning them here. So performance profiling, it's a great tool. Okay, it allows coaches to understand how an athlete views themselves and what the athlete thinks, what qualities the athlete thinks are needed for success in their sport. So this is just a great tool because you're asking the athlete, all right, well, what tools do you need to be successful? And I'll walk through the stages in a moment. So you can build an athlete's self-awareness, and then you can develop more targeted training schedules, practice, mental skills training, or even physical practice based on these things, which is another reason that they are so useful. So how does performance profiling work? It's really simple, and that's the beauty of it. It doesn't take a lot of training to figure this out. But I'm going to present it as like a 3-step process. And so you start by having the athlete. Well, basically, you're going to start by explaining it to the athlete and what the point is, the purpose of it, the concept, what are the benefits, and then you're going to have the athlete identify the key qualities that they believe are essential for successful performance in their sport. And this really can be kind of a collaborative process where you're guiding them along to think critically, because just for example, if you're working with younger athletes, they'll be able to identify some of those things, but they may not come up with an exhaustive list or a very long list, or they may miss some things. And so it can be helpful for you to give them some ideas if they're struggling to come up with them, or present them like, here's a list of traits that a lot of great athletes have, or possible traits. Which ones do you think are the most important? And so they go through those things and they define that, and then they can explain why they think they're the most important. Like I said, you collaborate with them and talk about those things. And then you have them say, okay, well, these are the most important. So now rate yourself on each of those qualities. Okay, where do you, and it can just be scale of 1 to 10. 10, you're like as good as you could be. 0 is like you're as bad as you possibly could be. It's as worse as it could be. And so then you use those ratings to monitor their progress and adjust training plans throughout the season, or come up with specific drills, either mental or physical drills, to address those things. Because the performance profile, it doesn't just have to be mental. It could be mental skills. You could just focus on mental attributes. You just do like a confidence performance profile. It's like, how confident are you on all of these things that you need? Where's your confidence at right now? So there's lots of ways that you can come up with this. Some of the one of the most common ways is to have a wheel, and the spokes of the wheel are the different attributes that the athlete thinks is important, and they rate themselves on those things. And then you work on the ones that they want to work on, the ones that they feel like are the most important for them to work on, which many times are the ones that they rated themselves lower than the others. But a really useful tool, really simple to implement, something that coaches can get a great return on investment for doing. So now I want to just recap the things and drive them home one more time, everything that I've covered in this presentation, just to sort of summarize. And the first thing I want to say is that a coach's role extends far beyond the physical training. There is a role for coaches to work on mental skills training, as long as it's within their scope of practice, of course. So coaches need to understand their ethical responsibilities in fostering that positive mental health environment, because they can promote athlete well-being, even though they're not some sort of clinical practitioner or anything like that. But obviously they can create an environment that promotes those things, positive mental health. And coaches can use some basic psychological tools, basic questionnaires, even if they come up with their own sort of questionnaires, like rate yourself on all of these things, and then they go through and the athletes rate them. And it can be similar to the performance profiling, or it can be a separate thing. Goal setting, so simple tools. And when coaches start implementing these things, essentially you're upskilling and you're providing a more complete service to your athletes. And this is one of those things in the sports psychology world that I'm a big time advocate for. It's like I want to become irrelevant. I want to become obsolete. I want to see coaches and athletes. I want to see athletes getting these resources from the people that have more touch points, and so I can be an sort of advisor, a mentor, and help these coaches and still work with athletes as necessary, but get them to the point to where they've got the skills, they've got everything that it is that they need. And if coaches do these things, they implement these practices, that can lead to the things like greater self-awareness and motivation and the well-being, but ultimately performance, right? Because that's what we're aiming for as well. So keeping that as the main backdrop. So that's all I have in this presentation. Thanks for listening all the way at the end. Have an awesome day.
Thank you for listening to this recording in the Sports Psych Lecture Series. I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something that you can apply in your life. Feel free to share this presentation with others who might be interested. And if you're interested in more content like this, visit the Fehr Advantage channel on YouTube, or find the Fehr Advantage podcast on Spotify, or visit my website at fehradvantage.com.